Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the Education Writers Association webinar, How States Are Using COVID-19 Relief Funding to Close the Childcare Chasm. I'm Mariana Dale and I report on early childhood at Southern California public radio station KPCC and LAist.com. And before we get started, I want to go over just a few quick housekeeping items. If you have a question for our speakers, which I hope and imagine that you will, you can go ahead and type them into the questions box. That is in the GoToWebinar control panel. There's like a little drop down. You can include your name, or you should include your name and affiliation when you ask your question. And please feel free to put it in there at any time during today's conversation, and know that we are going to get to them during Q&A toward the end of the session. And when we get to the end of the session, you're also going to see an evaluation survey. Please go ahead and fill that out. Your feedback is really important and it helps us improve. All right, let's get into it. The brain develops rapidly in the first 8 years of a child's life, and it builds a foundation for their future academic achievement, health outcomes, and life success. But for decades, high-quality childcare has been inaccessible to many families. Only the lowest income families qualify for publicly funded programs, and there's not enough space for everyone. The Center for American Progress found on average, families across the US pay more than $1,300 a month in childcare costs for just one infant. And despite this very high cost to families, the early education workforce is often making poverty-level wages. Early childhood educators are leaving the profession, sometimes to work at big box retailers like Target and Amazon for more competitive pay. During the pandemic, some childcare providers did close, but many kept their doors open even as schools shut down, and they did so at great personal and financial expense. Public health guidelines limited the number of children that could be cared for, which hurt their bottom line, and providers dug into their wallets to buy PPE and cleaning supplies. Elected leaders scrapped plans for historic levels of funding for childcare and pre-K in what was once the Build Back Better plan. And without this additional funding, it's unclear how much longer many of these providers are going to be in business, even as demand for childcare rises. So today we wanted to talk about how states are using the money that does exist, and how our stories can highlight the challenges and successes of the childcare field in the communities that we cover. So I want to introduce our wonderful panelists and thank them for being here today. First, we have Michelle Kang, who serves as the Chief Executive Officer at NAEYC. NAEYC is a global association dedicated to high-quality early learning for all children. Michelle also served as their very first Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer, and before that, filled various leadership roles during her 16-year tenure at Bright Horizons, an international provider of early education. Michelle, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And I also want to bring in Anna Markowitz. Anna is an assistant professor at the UCLA School of Education and Information Studies. She holds a doctorate in psychology and a master's of public policy from Georgetown University. Anna is part of a research policy partnership with the Louisiana Department of Education, which seeks to study and improve the early childhood education sector and its workforce. Now, Anna, I want you to start us out by explaining who exactly we're talking about when we talk about, childcare and early learning and care providers.
Yeah, absolutely. Slides. Yeah, so as I think probably the folks in the room know, one thing that makes early education a lot more complex to think about and to write and talk about than K-12 is that in many ways it's more front and center for early education that is providing services for sort of two distinct groups. So next. First, we need a system that's able to provide warm, responsive, intellectually stimulating, and language-rich environments for these kiddos. Next. But at the same time, ECE is very much for these folks as well. We need a system that's large and flexible enough that caregivers have access to safe, consistent care whenever they need it to sort of meet the demands of their busy lives. And in the United States, at least, in trying to meet both of these goals, which are often sort of viewed in policy circles as trading off from one another, we have sometimes struggled to do either very well. Next slide. What we have in the US is often described as a complex non-system. We have no universal EC system since it was vetoed by Nixon. Instead, parents can choose from a variety of settings to meet their needs. So for example, they might have an informal care setting where a family friend or a neighbor is doing that work. They may hire a nanny, or they may go to a small family daycare kind of situation. They might also access the formal sector. So they may send their child to center-based care in a religiously affiliated center, or a child care center, a Head Start center, or if it's available to them, state and local pre-K. This is a huge array of different options, and while some parents navigate these options with ease and sort of optimize across the different constraints they're facing, many parents do not. All parents sort of want the same thing for their kiddos. They want safe, reliable care. They want their kids to learn and be happy and make friends. Yet often their choice really comes down to what they happen to see advertised, where their friend is sending their kids, or what came up on Google Maps / who had a slot available. Next. And so while all of these settings are providing families with an essential service, it's important to note that the amount of public funding these sites receive varies substantially, and that alongside that, quality is varying as well. So even though those parents really want similar things for their kiddos, they're getting very different experiences based on where they actually end up going. Next slide. What is consistent across these settings, however, is that essentially the younger the child is, the younger the child the early educator serves, the less training the early educators receive, the fewer professional supports they receive, and the less they earn. And all of these factors do have real downstream implications for children and families. Again, the folks in this room know that the educators really are the backbone of this system. More than that, they do complex, emotionally and intellectually challenging work. They keep the centers open and functioning day in and day out, and they're with children as they pass through some of their most important milestones. Yet many of them are not in positions where they can do that work well without putting in a truly Herculean effort. There have been some incredible stories about this over the past 3 years, and really about the working conditions and instability that early educators face. This is a photo from a 2018 New York Times article that I use a lot of the time when I'm talking about this, because I think it's such a powerful image. But often when I'm talking about this, I do think it's important to highlight what I mean by low wages. And here I'm going to talk about childcare teachers, but this is true largely across settings. In national data, childcare teachers make an average of about $27,000 a year. In my data from Louisiana, they make an average of $20,000 a year, which is less than the federal poverty line for a family of 3. I had lead teachers making making exactly the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour in our data. And in our recent statewide survey of childcare providers, most are not providing medical benefits to their employees. And I highlight this because I think sometimes folks say, well, like budget. This isn't a budget issue. This is a compensation issue. Next slide. Aside from sort of feeling bad about that, which we assuredly should, the poverty wages are going to have real consequences for the young children that educators are spending many hours with every day. So over the next couple of slides, I'm just going to provide some data that we have on early educators from Louisiana, but I do want to note that this data is not altogether that different from data from other sources or national data. It's just what I know best. And I will say, just to give a pitch for our data, what's nice is that it has broad coverage of center-based settings that serve children aged 0 to 5, and we get very high response rates on our surveys because we pay early educators for their time. And so, in our data, for example, we capture about 70 to 80% of the early educators we went out to survey, so we're actually getting a really good look at the communities we're in. And the statewide data that I'll show you in a few slides is actually fully universal, which is also incredibly rare. So what do I want you to take away from this slide? Well, the first thing is that many children in early education settings across the many places they can go have depressed teachers. This figure shows results from 2018, 2019, and 2020 surveys, and I like to show all 3 years because depression is high across time points. You can see that it's averaging about 25% even prior to COVID. And of course, it's also very useful to show the spike that happened of about 30 to 40% after the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have since fielded surveys in 2021 and 2022, and these rates of depression have yet to go down to pre-COVID levels, though I would argue that even at pre-COVID levels, these are quite high. To give you a comparison point, these data are from almost all women. The rate of depression for women in the US prior to COVID was about 10%. Next slide. Part of the reason early educators might be struggling with their emotional well-being is because they are struggling with economic anxiety. So here on the left-hand side, you can see data on teachers' food insecurity in childcare, and on the right in school-based pre-K. Just to sort of ground us, food insecurity is essentially not knowing that you'll be able to access enough food for yourself and your family. So there's sort of an emotional component to it as well. And I really want to again highlight how high these rates are. These are early educators working full-time jobs, caring for our youngest children. And prior to COVID-19, 50% of early educators in childcare settings were food insecure. Now, this was smaller in school-based settings where they earn more money. This was more like a third, but just like on the last slide, I'm going to argue that a third is probably too high. Now, I do want to assure you that I'm not cherry picking. This is food insecurity data, but I could show you similar figures showing that, for example, 40% of these educators struggle to pay their medical bills, 60% struggle to pay their debts. And about a third of childcare teachers and about a fifth of school-based teachers say that it's very difficult to live on their incomes. Actually, in 2020, things did briefly look a little bit better as people were getting relief checks. In our most recent data, we see that financial insecurity is again getting worse, likely because of inflation. Next slide. And we know that these high levels of stress and depression are going to matter in the classroom. Caring for young children requires energy, good humor, patience. But if you are stressed or depressed, that has been empirically linked to lower quality interactions with young children, less warm teacher-child relationships, and increased behavior problems for children. Next slide. And sort of the last sort of important pre-COVID data point I'll point out is that it also means that these teachers are more likely to quit. Unlike the earlier data, which was from some select Louisiana communities, this is statewide data. So this is every early educator working in sites that receive public dollars in the state. And that is about 70% of all childcare centers in the state. And so this is basically Louisiana's data set is kind of the first of its kind that's able to track teacher turnover in the same way that K-12 schools are able to track teacher turnover. This is data from 2018 into 2019, but we have these data as far back as 2015. It's the same across time. Again, I'm not cherry picking here. And here you can see that about half of childcare teachers leave their sites each year. This is twice as high in school-based pre-K, where they make about twice as much money. But even that is about twice as high as what we see in K-12. For those of you who are curious, in Head Start, we're seeing kind of smack in the middle there at about 37%. Over a 3-year period, childcare sites will lose 75% of the teachers they hire. So it's just an incredible revolving door, and this instability will matter for the teachers who stay, for the families who are trying to find stable care, and for the young children that form relationships with these teachers who then leave them. And so this is sort of the key pre-COVID story, and I like to highlight it because we are trying to overlay these COVID solutions on top of what was a sort of fundamentally shaky foundation, and that's why efforts sort of need to be transformative more so than maybe a Band-Aid.
Thank you, Anna. And we did drop a link to some of her research in the chat, and we'll be dropping links to research and various other resources as this conversation goes on. Now, Michelle, I want to turn to you. A lot of the people in the audience today are perhaps very familiar with how we measure quality in the K-12 system, but I was hoping you could talk with us a little bit about what high quality looks like in early education and what you think the public sometimes gets wrong about this, and especially drawing from your work overseeing, program accreditation and professional learning in the early education sector.
Great. Thank you, Mariana, and thank you, Anna, for that wonderful grounding. It's great to be here with you today, and I'm glad to be here on behalf of our 60,000 members and 51 dynamic affiliates to elevate the stories of the field and the work that they do on behalf of young children and families. A high-quality early childhood education program provides a safe, nurturing environment that promotes the physical, social, emotional, and cognitive development of young children while responding to the needs of families. High quality early childhood education programs have well prepared staff who have formal training and professional development in early childhood education to support their knowledge, the skills, and competencies to be able to be effective in those programs. They have strong, diverse, effective leadership and intentional partnerships with families. These programs are holistic in that they're able to address the full scope and all domains of child development. They ensure children's health and safety, and they feature developmentally appropriate curriculum and center on social emotional learning. And they're also often well resourced in that they're able to equitably support and compensate a skilled and valuable early childhood education workforce, providing that early childhood education in small group sizes and low adult to child ratios to support high quality interactions in children's learning. There's sometimes a misconception that early childhood education is only one type of care, and Anna touched upon this in her introductory slides. Early care and education is delivered across a mixed delivery system, centers of all sizes, large programs, small programs, in rural areas, in urban areas. It's delivered in family childcare programs. It's delivered through Head Start, in public schools, and faith-based programs. It is equally possible to deliver high quality early childhood education rooted in the science of early learning in family childcare settings as it is in childcare programs, as it is in public schools. Quality, we know, is not determined by setting, nor age band, nor funding stream. There's also sometimes a misconception that high quality early education can be done by almost anyone. Delivering high quality early childhood education requires early childhood educators who possess the knowledge, skills, and competencies to do the work that is intrinsically vast and complex. Early childhood educators are laying down the foundation for learning, and this work is rooted in science and a vast field of research that informs their practice. There's nothing simple about being part of this profession, and it's important to understand the expertise of the early childhood educators because they possess enormous amounts of knowledge and competencies, experience that enable them to do this life-changing work every day. Because positive relationships are at the core of quality, investing specifically in the education and compensation of early childhood educators is the best thing we can do to improve early childhood education. Because when we underinvest in educators, we also undermine the quality of early childhood education programs, diminishing their short and long-term benefits and decreasing the return on investment and frankly harming children and families.
And I have a question, a lot of reporters, they're working on tight deadlines, and we may be trying to get in touch with people who are just the most public and the easiest to contact. And, if you go to Google, you often find large chain childcare centers, some of these family childcare providers who are providing care, high quality care, like you said, in their homes, often to families that may need unconventional hours or to working class families. They're a little bit harder to reach, but they are a critical part of this mixed delivery system. And so what advice would you have, Michelle, for reporters who are actively trying to reach a wider swath of early educators?
Well, first, I commend those reporters who are looking for those voices of the field. That is an important part of NAEYC, that we do work that centers the voices of the educators and looks to elevate those stories. We applaud that and would also welcome helping to facilitate that, especially through our membership and through our affiliates. But I do think that it is important to look for those avenues to find the voice of the field. Providers are often very willing to be able to share the impact of what they see happening every day in their programs, and to elevate the needs of what they are doing, and frankly also to tell the story on behalf of the families that they serve, because they are each day dealing with what they see with working parents who are trying to manage the demands of their lives. And so I would encourage reporters to continue to seek out those voices, to look for avenues through providers, either locally. NAEYC is always happy to facilitate those connections as well, through our local connections, frankly through our affiliates who are on the ground every day, connected to our membership and to the educators doing the work across different delivery systems.
And Anna, any other resources you would add to that for how reporters can best reach the people doing this work every day?
Yeah, I think another place that we look sort of thinking from a more policy lens is talking to those childcare resource and referral agencies. They're often doing really strong work with early education centers and can get you in touch with someone who has really exciting experiences. Some places, not all, there are also unions that you could reach out to, which I think would give you a different setting for finding the voices of early educators and maybe folks that have thought really collectively about what folks need and want.
Yeah, and just for a little terminology here, resource and referral agencies. Here, I'll just give example here where I am in California. These are kind of a pass-through agency for the federal funding that comes through the Child Care Development Block Grant. And so they have relationships with both parents and child care providers because they're trying to facilitate people who qualify for subsidized childcare actually getting connected to that care. And so, yeah, that's definitely a type of organization that has been super helpful to me in my work. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the workforce. This is something that has been seen as really hindering the rebound of childcare, and one of the factors that is making it harder for families to find childcare as they are trying to get back into the workforce. Anna, like you mentioned, we were, the field was aware of early educator turnover and attrition and has been for years. But what do we know about how that has changed, during the pandemic?
Sure. So I think maybe probably a lot of folks have seen the recent CAP report that had this sort of beautiful figure that was up earlier showing that there was this large loss of early educators from the workforce right at the start of COVID, much like we saw from a variety of other sectors, and that although there has been sort of a rebound, we're still about 10% smaller overall. Of course, that masks wide variability across the United States. That's BLS data. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics is giving us this national view. Oh yeah, sorry, I have this on the slide. Thanks. And so I think this is a telling figure because it shows that although we have rebounded, there's still going to be challenges, and in particular, there will be challenges for young families in specific areas that face bigger challenges and bigger needs, depending on sort of how hard COVID hit in those spaces. So this is the figure. This is a report from the Center for American Progress. I encourage you to look it out. It provides some really nice context, but you can see we're still about 10% smaller. Next slide. Just to give you sort of a sense of what that looks like in Louisiana, these are statewide survey data. So we talked to sort of all the childcare leaders in the state for these data in the summer of 2021, and we sort of asked them, like, how many of your positions are you struggling to fill right now? And you can see that 35% said that they were at least 25% understaffed, and only a quarter said, yes, we're fully staffed right now. Next slide. And that will matter for children and families, of course. So this is the percentage of those childcare leaders who endorsed having to make specific changes to their sites due to the fact that they were struggling with staffing. So you can see that 84% said they asked staff to work more hours, to take on additional roles, building on that already high staff burden that sort of Michelle was talking about. 75% said that they were really worried about staffing issues negatively affecting children. Leaders have their hands, their fingers on the pulse of what's happening at their sites, and they know that staff that are suddenly having to oversee very many children struggle to build as tight and cohesive relationships. And almost 50% said that they were serving fewer children or turning away families. And I think this is really the story that we're getting, sort of, oh no, families can't find care. It's a very important story. But I think just as important is that second bar that says, hey, we're also struggling to provide the kind of care, the kind of quality we know that we want to provide. We, leaders wrote a lot of different sort of write-ins about how they were feeling about it. And I love this quote because I think it really captures the way that leaders have this great bird's eye view of the issue. This leader said, I need to be able to pay my teachers a living wage. It's not fair for them to work so hard and be compensated so little. Many of them are becoming tired of the small checks and are talking about finding other work. Their jobs are important. We're the reason parents are able to go to work or school. As you sort of see this broad problem, and then in local pockets, these really huge problems as people can go to the big box stores, as Mariana said at the beginning of the talk. Thanks.
So whenever I'm talking to folks like yourself, researchers, providers themselves, advocates for the field, pretty much everyone agrees that increased public investment is a big missing piece here and is a contributing factor to some of these challenges that we have been talking about. And it is complicated. So Michelle, I was hoping you could give us a quick overview. What are the different funding streams that reporters can start to dig into when they look at, what's paying or not paying for childcare in their communities?
Sure, I'd be glad to. At the federal level, the Child Care and Development Block Grant, or CCDBG, there's a lot of letters there, is the primary program that helps low-income families access childcare, providing states with funding to address affordability and improve quality. All states have requirements that they must meet in terms of health and safety regulations, eligibility requirements for families, training and professional development for early childhood educators, licensing and monitoring for programs, and opportunities for quality improvement across the system. But states also have significant flexibility around the implementation of these requirements as they distribute the funds throughout their communities. CCDBG maintains state flexibility, increases parent choice, and supports health, safety, and licensing standards to keep children safe in all settings. However, CCDBG policies and funding levels are constrained in ways that limit supply, quality, and compensation, and ensure families who need childcare support won't get it. In the same vein, we know that childcare isn't a red state or a blue state issue, and it is why all 50 states currently have an existing childcare program that is primarily funded using federal dollars, and 44 states in the District of Columbia fund pre-K programs. There was a lot of anticipation that the Biden administration's Build Back Better plan would include money for childcare provisions like universal pre-K, caps on the cost paid by families, and increased wages. But those plans were not materialized last month from the most recent version of the legislation. So what happens without that funding? The reality is that the challenges with access, affordability, and quality in childcare and early learning just remain throughout the system widespread. And without substantial and sustainable investments, our nation will continue to struggle to address the systemic challenges that have plagued the childcare market for parents and providers. And the scale and the urgency of the challenges of high childcare prices, childcare deserts, and low compensation. And owners and directors of programs are struggling. As Anna mentioned, they want to be able to make this work. They want to be able to serve their families, but they aren't able to financially plan their way out of a market failure. They can't budget with revenue that they don't have and expenses that exceed what families can afford to pay. So we've heard today, and I think that hopefully this is conveyed through what both Ann and I are sharing, is that America's childcare crisis is the result of decades of underinvestment, which has created an untenable business model for providers that make it nearly impossible for early educators to have a wage from which they can live on, and for parents to be able to find affordable, high quality care in the ways that we would like for them to.
Yeah, and Anna, I don't know if you wanted to add to that some of the consequences that might result if the system continues to be funded in the way it has been for years without any additional investment.
Yeah, so I think everything that Michelle is saying really makes me think of this sort of initial question of who is ECE for, and often the CCDBG dollars are tough because fundamentally that was conceived of as a workforce support set of money. And so often states are left in this place where they're trying to decide more subsidies with less value or fewer subsidies with higher value. Who are we leaving out to dry here? Are we leaving providers out to dry, or are we leaving families out to dry? So without sort of more money in the mix, we're going to be doing just that, leaving somebody out to dry. And most states right now, the administrators know this, they're very plugged in. They're left with making a choice that makes nobody happy. I think one thing that is potentially exciting, or if we're going to sort of look for a new place to go, is that states have been doing a lot with the COVID relief dollars that they have been getting. We saw many states providing sort of payments to sites to provide these one-time cash bonuses. Some people paid directly out to providers. A lot of people experimented with paying sites for that. In Louisiana, they implemented something called the Teacher Support Grant, which basically was a per site, very large lump sum payment, $3,200 per classroom. And they said, look, this money has to get out to providers. We're currently doing some research on that. Both New Mexico and Virginia are experimenting with new funding formulas that are putting as a baseline that early educators have to receive a certain amount per hour. This might vary from sort of setting a flat wage of like $15 an hour, which is good, but not enough. Or they may be doing more like saying, we're going to set it a certain percentage of what a K-12 educator makes. These are the kind of bolder steps that I think are going to be necessary. I know that folks are thinking, you know, if we can kind of create a better system using these fledgling dollars that we have now, can we create the demand for real reform? And so I think it's a big opportunity to pay attention to the ways that states have been experimenting, and hopefully for researchers to do a little bit of work figuring out what was the most effective strategy.
And if you have questions for Anna or Michelle, just a quick shout out to our audience, please go ahead and drop those in the questions box. We are going to get to them in about 10 minutes or so, but that allows us to start queuing them up and getting them in order so you can put them in the questions box. And yeah, Michelle, before I give you a chance to add to that conversation, I just want to, you know, set the baseline for folks that, you know, the American Rescue Plan, it was $39 billion that was funneled out to states to help support their child care system. So yeah, Michelle, tell us a little bit more about what NAEYC has learned about how that money is being spent and what's most interesting or exciting to you.
Yeah, well, and it was a very exciting time in terms of this historic investment for childcare relief, much needed, and came at a time where now we are able to see that there are some really exciting things that have happened with that funding that we frankly love to see continue. So I first want to just give a shout out to those folks. If you're connected to a state and you're seeing you're involved in the state early education conversations about what is being done, continue the good work. I would love to highlight just a couple examples that we've seen in terms of some promising policy proposals being implemented at the state level. Connecticut finalized their state budget that included $70 million in state funds to be used to supplement wages for every employed childcare staffer in all childcare settings. And I just want to emphasize that again, all settings, because that is something that is so important when we think about early care and education. New Mexico, their early childhood education and care department launched a new teacher recruitment campaign that lifts up the important role of being an early childhood educator. They are addressing head-on some of the misconceptions about what the field is, but also addressing the importance and the value of what early educators do in terms of their time and investment for our youngest learners. And my understanding is that this campaign will operate as a major public space and virtual campaign. Illinois, they created the Great Start, which stands for Strategy to Attract and Retain Teachers Wage Program. It's the Great Start Wage Program. And it provides biannual wage supplements for teaching staff, rewarding educational attainments and program tenure. These wage supplements are paid directly to the individual on a 6-month schedule based on continued employment at the same center and program. Again, that is incenting and supporting educators to be at a program and provide some of that stable staffing that we know that children benefit from, but also programs benefit from. And it's exciting to hear that these are just a couple ways that funding has gone to states and where they have innovated and looked for ways to lean into addressing some of the workforce challenges. We know that there are other examples where states have been supporting professional development and higher education, looking for ways to address the fact that even some of the regulations around childcare, there's opportunities to be able to see how to innovate again in the spaces that they have. And this relief funding that our sector received has been able to realize some of the possibilities in terms of solutions. But I do want to highlight that, frankly, there is a real concern that state administrators are grappling with as it relates to sustaining what they have invested in and replicating and expanding these approaches once the funding runs out.
And I wanted to bring up the issue of equity. And here in California and in many places, the majority of the childcare workforce is women, and it is women of color. And some research from the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment, which has been mentioned a few times, shows that it's often women of color who are in the types of positions that are making the least amount of money. And so I wonder if both of you can weigh in on what types of supports might be able to lift up the sectors of the field that really need the most support at this time. Anna, we can start with you.
Yeah, so I think so first of all, the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment shows not only that women of color are often more likely to be in the kinds of roles where they are paid less money, but even within the same role, there's some evidence that suggests that women of color are paid less than their white counterparts. This is a huge issue for equity just in general. If you care about equity, if you don't care about equity, it also really matters for children and families. There's lots of evidence that suggests for families and for children, it's really helpful to have an educator that shares their race ethnicity. So in my own work, we've shown that parents are more likely to be involved in their early childhood settings if they share provider race ethnicity. There's also data suggesting that kids' growth and development improves at a higher rate if they are in a classroom where their provider shares their race ethnicity. And of course, for very young children, parents quite reasonably have a preference for providers who can help share some of that cultural transmission. Language match, for example, can be very important as little bilinguals are coming into schools. I apologize if you can hear the lawnmower that just appeared outside of my office window. That's great. So for all these reasons, it's incredibly important. In terms of strategies, I think what's really important is looking to the evidence that suggests that when we sort of make these big blanket changes, like everybody has to have a BA now, we are very likely to whiten the workforce because of structural racism and systemic inequality that makes it more difficult for some folks in the United States to access bachelor's degrees than others. And so as we start thinking about the investments in the different places that children get care, first maintaining diversity of investments into the variety of places families go for care. So not leaving family child care out because we think we want to invest in quality. And then when we make policies about professionalizing and supporting the training and development of the workforce, Michelle was talking about sort of professional learning opportunities, for example, making sure that those are provided equitably, perhaps free of cost to educators, thinking about making sure that everybody can access those at an equivalent rate, or making policy adjustments that allow folks to access them with some ease. I will now mute myself. I apologize.
Oh no, no worries. We actually, it's not too loud for us at all. So, and Michelle, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important to acknowledge the fact that the majority of early care and education is delivered by Black and Brown women. And the fact that their experiences and what Anna said, which is that, you know, we need to continue to acknowledge the conditions and the systemic realities of what early care and education has created, that we are going to continue to advocate for supports that allow educators to stay in this field, to see themselves in this profession, to see leaders who represent the ways that they have been able to come up and be seen in the field, and to be able to know that the work that they are doing on behalf of young children is so critically important that we are not going to leave them behind in the ways that we are structuring of supports, the way that we structure our policies, and the way that we structure our programs, and the way that we structure solutions. And in that way, you know, I know that we touched upon states. I think that there are, you know, ultimately a lot of work that we can continue to do on behalf of the field to advocate for recognizing that compensation and benefits and support is needed for these educators to continue to do the work that they're doing daily, wherever they are.
Yeah, and something you had mentioned earlier was, you know, the importance of training and access to professional development for educators. I'm wondering how you've seen that rolled out in a way that makes it really accessible to the field, you know, a workforce that's working 12, 14-hour days, and so maybe don't have the same flexibility as someone who typically is attending a job training program might have? What are ways that that training can be rolled out in a way that reaches the most educators?
I can start here, Michelle, or if you want to.
Go ahead.
So we're actually in the middle of evaluating the Louisiana program, and I think it's a good cautionary tale. What they have done is created something called the Early Childhood Ancillary Certificate. It's basically a specialized version of the CDA, which is the Child Development Associate, which is sort of a large-scale early educator credential. They have made the program free to all educators. They have made it locally accessible. It's often online. And once you earn this degree, this ECAC, you are eligible for bonuses of up to $3,200, which is quite sizable given what I said their baseline wage was, right? That's, you know, another 20% on top of their wage. What's a real challenge, though, is that we see that 75% of folks that start the ECAC actually drop out of the ECAC. And for many, it's because of this sort of baseline compensation issue. I can't stay in this job. I need to go do something else. And so I think one way for me to think about ensuring equity is thinking about these things in tandem and not sort of saying to educators, get some sort of degree first, then we'll pay you. Instead, thinking we're going to provide fair compensation, and that's going to make these make it feasible for you to go into some of these roles. I think also providing funds for childcare centers so they can allow, for example, their teachers to go and do professional development as a paid expense and as part of their workday. This is very common in K-12. It is not common in early education spaces. Something as innovative as developing a subpool, for example, could go a long way in allowing childcare centers, which operate on very tight margins, to be able to run and continue movement throughout the day while still allowing their early educators to go out and get the professional training that many of them crave.
Yeah. I would echo, Anna, the things that you shared, you know, acknowledging their current challenge in terms of, you know, the hours that they are often working. When you think about many early educators are working long days, family childcare providers in particular, you know, are providing care in their home, and again, long hours. And so we have to acknowledge the context under which that they are operating, while also acknowledging that we want to help provide them the support. You know, early educators want to receive that support and professional development. They just want to be acknowledged in terms of being able to provide the ways and the avenues to do it. So whether it is funding for programs to be able to pay their staff and then to also pay for the actual educational access, you know, we know that there is financial support to engage in this learning, but they need, you know, to have supports. We also know that it's really useful and important when early educators can go through learning together. For example, in cohorts, there are very successful models out there, like what we see with Teach, because it lifts up the community and also connects them. We know that educators oftentimes, you know, they have each other, especially if they're in a center-based program, but often they value also connecting with other educators to learn from each other, to share with each other best practices. So, you know, we need to address that. But also, one other thing I want to highlight is language access. You know, so thinking about all the ways that early educators can get that support and development, both the time, the support, the language in which they need to receive it, and acknowledging that that is an important part of who they are and what they do in terms of their development, and knowing that in many cases that often means having a partnership with families to say, we're going to value the time that your educators are caring for and supporting your children. We need to also value that they need to have support for professional development. And, you know, oftentimes what we hear that the field, when you're engaged in an open partnership with families, the families too are very supportive of that, understanding, and frankly that they want that for their educators as well.
Thanks, Michelle. And, you know, one program reporters might want to look out for in their communities are apprenticeship programs. We've increasingly seen, you know, an attempt to kind of modify this very traditional trade-based model of professional development to address some of these challenges that you all have been talking about. Now I want to bring on Angelina for our very first audience question.
Hi, everyone. So as a reminder, please drop any questions in the questions box instead of the chat. We will start with Jeannie Lindsay from the Seattle Times, who is wondering what repercussions or ripple effects does child care challenges have on both K through 12 and higher education, and how might those be changing?
Michelle, you want to start us off?
Sure. Yeah, so great question. And, you know, I think want to point back to what we have been sharing today, that early education is the foundation for all children's learning. And if we think about what is happening if we are underinvesting for those youngest learners before they, before they get to kindergarten, and have they received the supports and the opportunity to be exposed and developed to the concepts that we know that are so important in terms of their development for social emotional learning, for language, for literacy. With fewer children being able to access high quality early childhood education because of supply, and that's been one of the things that has become highly prevalent in the current conditions, is just the lack of access to high quality care. When fewer parents have access to high quality early learning environments, then their children potentially will not have the access to be able to be supported, so that when they approach and start their kindergarten ages, that they haven't had the benefit of some of the things that we know that are so critically important when the brain development is happening so rapidly. So then we will potentially see the impacts of additional needs in terms of supports in K-12 education, many things that could have been averted with investments in those early years, because we would have been able to work on those foundational things that are so critical when the brain is developing at the speed that it is. I do want to also just share, and it hasn't come up today actively in conversations, but just in terms of the definition of early care and education, we're often very quick to define that as the space that is under the age of 5. But in fact, that the science and the research defines early education in that space is 0 to 8. So the K3 space is often not recognized as part of the space of early learning, but it is part of the brain science research that exemplifies that's the period of the rapidest brain development. It is 0 to age 8, and understanding the full continuum of education and early learning as a piece of that is critically important.
I think I would add 2 things to Michelle's amazing answer. I think the first thing to also remember is that it's likely to exacerbate inequality. So I think it is absolutely true that almost all parents in the United States struggle to pay for high quality care. It's incredibly expensive, as Mariana noted at the very beginning of the talk. No matter who you are, $1,300 a month is a decent amount of money, or not no matter who, but most. But this is likely to exacerbate inequality, as some parents are able to make moves and find sort of high quality care anywhere, but many will not. And so what you're actually looking at, especially in the early grades, is this highly variable preparation, and that can be really challenging for educators. It can also lead to some of the sort of disproportionate disciplinary issues that we've been seeing, and that's happening sort of in pre-K as well. We're sort of seeing it trickle down whenever kids are starting school. We're seeing this disproportionality. So thinking really hard about the fact that it's an inequality problem, not just sort of an overall problem. And I think the second piece of it is that when parents can't find good care, or care that is stable, that they know they can access, it affects their ability to work, and that affects family income, and that has downstream effects on children's development as well. And so what we're really seeing here is early care and education in any capacity being the bedrock for family stability, which matters a lot for children's development.
And I would add one more avenue that reporters, especially those looking at higher education, might explore is how accessible childcare is for parenting students on campus. The cost of childcare is a huge barrier to any parent who might be looking to go back to school. And you have seen some colleges try to address this by providing, additional services or subsidies. And so that's another avenue that I think is a really rich one to explore as well. It does look like we have someone who has their hand raised. If you do have a question, make sure to go ahead and put it into the questions box. That is the mechanism by which we are getting your questions answered today.
Thank you for the reminder, Mariana. Now, Jeannie has a second question, but just in the interest of time, we're going to move on for now and return if we have some time at the end. Arlie Rogers from the Associated Press wants to know, how might these investments in teachers and schools repair students' learning and maturity losses caused by the pandemic and/or online learning?
Do you want to start, Michelle, or would you like me to?
I lost my internet in the middle of the question. So go ahead, Anna and Angelina, if you could just drop it into the chat.
Will
yes.
do.
I think there is some hope that these investments are going to key part of shoring that up. One thing that's true is that there's not a lot of great data yet showing what the implications for very young children of the pandemic was in terms of learning and development. Sort of based on theory and previous research, we have every reason to suspect that there are going to be some challenges for very young children. So, for example, increased food insecurity, poverty, the trauma that many families went through with loss has created a situation where many young children maybe didn't experience the same types of developmental supports that they would have in the absence of a global pandemic. So people are hoping that investments in early education now are going to sort of stem the tide a little bit. And the idea would be that being able to provide high quality relationships early on, create stable settings for children to spend time in, be able to identify early on some of those social and emotional challenges that children might be experiencing due to difficulties that their families may have experienced, and potentially kind of doing early identification for special services, maybe around language or reading, in order to prevent sort of the long-term need for special education. So that's what folks are hoping for in the birth to 5 space, and then in the sort of kinder through 3rd grade space that is incredibly important that Michelle was just talking about. People are hoping to sort of see similar investments play out as well.
I think Anna covered it, so I don't have anything to add.
Thank you. Our next question is from Lauren Camera from the U.S. News and World Report. In the wake of the pandemic forcing millions of women out of the workforce, many due to childcare responsibilities, there's been growing support for universal childcare and pre-K based on the argument that it opens economic doors for women, grows GDP, and is just better for business. What recent shifts have you seen in the early ed space around that notion?
Michelle, if you want to start us out.
Yeah, so I do think it is so important to highlight this, which is something that we are hearing still every day. I actually just talked to a provider yesterday who said that she has 100 families on her wait list with people who want to be able to get back into the workforce but have not been able to find care. And by addressing the childcare shortage and the challenges that we have in the staffing and the availability of high quality care, we will be able to help support women in particular being able to return to the workforce in the numbers that they were prior to the pandemic. So we know this is the case. And, I would say that one thing that's been interesting that I've observed is that employers in particular who are seeing that this is their challenge, they can't actually have the skilled workers in their workforce to be able to, do the work that they are doing, whatever their industry, that there needs to be childcare addressed in some way, shape, or form, are coming to the table and actually investing more in some solutions, that go beyond even the traditional bricks and mortar investment in an on-site childcare facility, but look at, addressing the supply of care in their communities, looking for ways to facilitate supporting understanding of what quality care looks like, looking for ways to open up access opportunities. So, I think in one place, that is one thing that I've heard more of is that employers recognize that this is actually may not have been a challenge that they would have directly addressed prior to the pandemic, but it's become a very real issue for them because they are not able to address being the workforce that they want to be. So addressing childcare is good, not just for the workers who need childcare, but overall good for the totality of the business, and then frankly good for the economy and the community.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is I think there have been some movements around power to the profession, which I find pretty exciting. I think the bottom line is that for a long time, our economy has run on exploiting the labor of particularly Black and brown women that are working in these early education settings. We have paid them a very low wage. We have expected them to do this work for us. This is sort of bottoming out, and it's creating an opportunity for people to assert the value of what they do, both for sort of the economy, but also for all the other things Michelle was talking about in terms of what we're doing for very young children, how important that is. So I think the power to the profession stuff has been exciting. I also have heard a little bit more conversation around broader ideas around what it would mean to support young children and the folks that work with young children. And so that includes thinking about family leave and, paid maternity, paternity, and thinking also about the child tax credit, things like that. So parents get to have choice and agency and finding providers that meet their specific needs as well. And so I think thinking about that broader package has been an exciting trend. And I think early educators are really on board with that because they face really high costs for caring for infants as well. And there could be sort of a shift in what responsibilities they have to take on if we could think about holistic solutions.
I love, Anna, that you shared the power to the profession, because that is something that, of course, NAEYC has been very involved with and continues to work in terms of the commission. But for those who may not be out there, we do have a website called powertotheprofession.org. It describes the work of 15 national organizations coming together to talk about the workforce and the professionalization of the workforce and the ways that we can help support creating frameworks and structures that recognize the work that, that early educators do, the supports that are needed, addressing equity squarely head on as we think about this as well. And frankly, the work continues with a commission of national organizations that will include educator voice. And that's something that is very exciting as we think about the work that's being done to talk about what it looks like to truly bring this profession to a different level of conversation that's embedded in our policy structures and embedded in our communities very differently than it is today.
At this time, I want to just quickly share, we have a comment from an audience member who is a home-based provider who just wants to let everyone here know that, you know, due to state restrictions, they can only have 6 children at once, but they currently have a wait list for about 25 children. So if that helps give you a little bit of context into what we're looking at a local level, I hope that gives a little color. And Mariana, do we have time for one quick last question? Okay, great. So. Jeannie Lindsay's second question. We touched upon this ever so slightly, but how does the lack of childcare support for families or workers impact educational equity and student outcomes?
Yeah, so Michelle, do you want to start or?
Anna, since you're starting, go ahead.
No, I think there isn't, you know, like a number I can give you or anything that would be really specific, but I think it aligns with what we said before. We know that this is a foundation that children build on once they get to school, and that the difference in the foundation that kids have really matters. High quality programs are not necessarily just ones that are teaching letters and numbers, but they're ones that get kids excited about learning, that give them agency, that allow them to sort of play and grow and explore. So I think those sorts of things will matter in the long term, but there's not really data that can say like they will close the achievement gap by 30%. It's just not there, unfortunately.
Yeah, the reality is that we know that the brain science says that investing in these early years is going to be so critical and so important, and that the investments in educators to be able to support the work that is done with young children is only going to help build on and enable us to truly get young children and families supported in the ways that we all want in order to have our communities thrive, you know, businesses, families, schools alike. So I hope the takeaway message today is that this is that we are seeing that families are struggling to access care while providers are struggling to address the workforce challenges, and we need to find deliberate ways for us to address those challenges so that we don't continue to create the circumstances we have.
And just, I would consider this a lightning round question. Anna, what is one story idea that you would love to see, you know, splashed across headlines and front pages of websites and on the radio, just everywhere tomorrow if you had a magic wand?
Oh, yikes. I don't think this is necessarily a story idea, but I would love to see more focus on the complexity and challenge of the work early educators do. I think we see a lot on how hard the work is, but we don't see a lot on sort of the fact that it's intellectually rich. And that I think really matters for how these folks are respected for the work they do.
And Michelle.
And I would love if reporters would talk to state and local officials and press them and ask them about the childcare challenges and the ongoing childcare crisis, how it's impacting their communities, what are they seeing in terms of their constituents, and highlighting the stresses on families and the stresses on providers and ways that we can address those challenges.
Well, thank you, Michelle Kang, CEO of NAEYC, Anna Markowitz, Assistant Professor at the UCLA School of Education and Information Studies. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom with us here today. We have tons of links in the chat where you can learn more about their work. Thank you to everyone who took time out of your day to attend this webinar in service of broadening and deepening your coverage of the early childhood field. It's one that I've become incredibly passionate about in the last couple of years. So please consider, me a resource as well. Angelina is going to join us right now to share some final notes for EWA. And a thank you to EWA as well for really prioritizing this topic and making space to have this conversation today.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Anna. Just as a reminder to the audience, as soon as the webinar closes, you will see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is very important to us and helps EWA improve. Finally, please visit ewa.org/events to sign up for any upcoming online and in-person seminars. Thank you all so much and have a great day.
Thank you.